Hey everyone, this is lecture 6.1. In this one, we're going to talk about what we should expect in terms of climate change. And this specific lecture is going to focus on consumption. So there is the agenda actually for this series of lectures. 6.1 will be consumption, and then 6.2 is going to be social movements and also including how climate change and crime can be related to each other. So most of us are very aware that the way we consume is a problem in our society, and that consumption is actually a major part of the climate crisis itself, which if we think about it for a second makes tons of sense. Not only are the materials that we use materials, but also the energy that makes those materials often creates excesses of carbon. The exact nature, however, of that problem can be better understood by applying some sociological principles, and then some of those principles indicates ways that we can be more climate conscious. Regardless of our consumption patterns, though, it should be recognized that humans need things, right? If you have taken a entry-level sociology or psychology class, you'll know all about Maslow's hierarchy of needs. The hierarchy of needs basically establishes the concept that there are simply some things that humans need more, and there are other things that we need a little bit less, with physiological needs, our needs for physical safety, our needs for eating being at the bottom, and then love and self-esteem being in the middle, and then unfortunately, our need, well, for some people, our needs for self-actualization, of achievement, being at the top, and the unfortunate element there is that many people don't actually get to that point. However, Maslow's hierarchy does not explain why we overconsume, both as humans and specifically why Americans overconsume. We additionally may choose to go without something for ideological reasons. Maslow doesn't really explain why somebody would choose not to eat at all, really. So maybe you decide to go on strike with everyone else in your union. That may not directly apply to the food that you eat, but it could put that kind of in jeopardy. And Maslow really, from this model, that can't be accounted for. Additionally, there are things like religious fasting that are not accounted for in Maslow's hierarchy. And additionally, it does not take personal preference into account, which preference sounds kind of trivial if you're trying to think about something like human hunger, but I will tell you, having experienced and seen food pantries and having experienced vicariously the administration of a food pantry via my wife, I'll tell you that needs and preferences go very closely together. Food pantries often cannot give away certain types of food only because people don't really know how to cook them or make them, or it's not something they're comfortable with. Because when people are in need, not only are they seeking physical sustenance, they are also, to a certain subconscious extent, seeking out comfort. This can go along with another concept called the Easterlin paradox, which explains that there is a weak relationship between wealth and actual happiness. And this can be quite complementary in terms of Maslow's hierarchy. Maslow's hierarchy looks at physical needs, while the Easterlin paradox looks at happiness itself. The concept here being that there's actually a weak relationship, whether you're calling it a correlation or a causation, there's a weak relationship between wealth and happiness itself. There is some truth to the adage, money doesn't buy happiness. However, within the Easterlin paradox, it has been found that, yes, of course, very poor people are less happy. namely because they're actively physically suffering. However, middle class and working class people in the studies surrounding Easterlin's work explains that they're about as happy as those we would call rich people. And then additionally, incredibly rich people, those people we would classify as the 1%, often report lower rates of happiness than actual middle class people. The why for that is there are a couple reasons. The first of which being that it takes more money, it takes more energy to account for your money itself, and then additionally, actually having your needs met is, you can be happy and not be quite there. Anyway, though, this also is accounted for by Veblen's theory of the leisure class, which is quite helpful for understanding American consumption and accounting for our consumerist culture. Our culture as Americans basically says, okay, we have to buy stuff. We have to buy stuff in this situation, we have to buy stuff in that situation, and because of that, we buy more than other societies tend to. Specifically, Veblen observed that a significant portion of consumption behavior is about power and status. The things you have, the things you surround yourself by, we tend to attribute to how important and how powerful you are. It should be pointed out that people of all classes engage in this behavior. Yes, of course, the hyper wealthy buy very expensive things to show off the things they can afford. Things like yachts, things like expensive cars, whatever. But also, working class and middle class people do this stuff as well, right? So, for example, I always think of old projection TVs in this regard. When I was a kid in the 1990s, I knew a couple families that had these really big, boxy projection TVs. Keep in mind, this is in the era before modern LCD screens, right? So a television that was large was actually kind of rare. This is clearly an example of this same type of behavior that a hyper wealthy person would put into getting a yacht. Additionally, though, Veblen breaks this behavior into three categories: conspicuous consumption, conspicuous leisure, and conspicuous waste. It should be pointed out that many of these behaviors are actually subconscious. We don't think about, hey, I'm going to buy this to look important. We have more conscious ideas as to why we're doing this behavior. It could be something like, well, I just like this thing. Yeah, it costs a lot, but I like it, right? I'm not trying to impress people. Okay, but there could be a subtle element of that too there. It's Christmas is often used. I'll talk about that in a minute. Or, I deserve a vacation. I like to travel too, but what does that mean to deserve a vacation? Why am I spending my time off in that way? There are a lot of these things resting in the background of our brains. But regarding conspicuous consumption specifically, this is defined as consuming material goods because they are perceived to be of high status. And tied in with conspicuous consumption is the idea of positional goods. If something is hard to get and if it is expensive to get, then it's more likely to be a positional good. If you're wearing a Rolex watch, for example, and it's an actual real Rolex watch, that is a positional good. A Rolex watch tells you time just like a cheap watch from Target would. However, it is a matter of showing, hey, I'm fancy, hey, this is expensive, whatever. And I use the word fancy a lot in this regard because little girls tend to use the term fancy when they're impressed by things. Additionally, then, new video game systems could be counted as being positional goods, or designer clothes tend to be also classified as positional goods. When you are impressed by someone immediately, it could be that you recognize that their clothes are super expensive, and it could also be that you don't even recognize that consciously. Sometimes we're just impressed by people upon seeing them, but why are we impressed by them? It could be because their clothes are very expensive. Now, in this regard, conspicuous consumption can be quite intriguing in terms of its environmental consequence. Obviously, if we are consuming things that are wasteful to the environment, that's bad and we want to minimize that. However, there are also examples of where we could take advantage of tendencies toward conspicuous consumption to actually help things that are happening in our environment. For example, the illegal trade in rhino horns could be taken advantage of to try to, conspicuous consumption could be taken advantage of to try to minimize poaching. This was explained to me when I was visiting the wilds, which is about an hour south of Columbus. I promise you that picture of the rhinoceros in the upper picture, I actually took that picture myself. He is actually seeking apples that the kids that are in front of him have. He is in no pain and actually just wants a treat. But though, and while we were talking with the rhinos, the zookeepers explained to us that there are people who are making the argument that rhino keepers should remove and start stockpiling rhinoceros horns, namely because rhinoceros horns are the things that are sold for value on the black market when rhinoceroses are killed. Now, rhino horns can absolutely be removed from the rhino without actually hurting the rhinoceros. In that way, it's really similar to trimming your fingernails. And additionally then, biochemically, rhinoceros horn and fingernails are actually the same exact thing. The reason why people seek out rhino horn is there are cultural misconceptions that rhino horn can be used in medicine for a variety of reasons, but including male virility. So, i.e., the same reason why they would do something like take Viagra. However, not only does Viagra exist, but rhino horn is not going to help you in that regard. It just isn't. It doesn't do that, right? But even though it doesn't do that, people will buy rhino horn to try to fix that problem. However, if the conservationists stockpile the rhino horn until they have a simply tremendous amount of it, it is theoretically possible that if they flood the black market with rhino horn, then the price of it will go down, and then also it would effectively destroy the rhino horn market by no longer making it a positional good. Now, obviously, there are some huge ways that that plan could backfire, but it's an interesting example of thinking about how we can take advantage of a ugly tendency in society that could cause people to actually start doing things that would help the environment itself. Conspicuous leisure, then, is engaging in activities because they are rare or expensive. So instead of things, we're talking about activities. There are two quick definitions you need here before I can really give the examples. Leisure is the time that we have to do what we want. It is a kind of time. And then recreation is the things we do during that time. So should this be called conspicuous recreation? Maybe. A really good example of conspicuous leisure is, oh, I just laid in bed until noon and I just did nothing, and kind of bragging about that to people. That is a luxury some people have and other people simply don't have, right? Hopefully, if you're watching this and you are in your early 20s, you are able to actually do this at this point in your life to a certain degree. Please enjoy. This is the oldest man in the world thing to say it. Please enjoy it now, because there could be a time in your life when you can't do that. That is conspicuous leisure. And bragging about it, especially, is also conspicuous leisure. Tied in with this, then, is an idea of vicarious consumption, or vicarious leisure, or vicarious waste. Vicarious blank is doing these behaviors through children or maybe other family members. My biggest time I see this is when I'm talking to other parents at our local elementary school. They would maybe tell you about this like elite camp their kids are going to, or they make their kids' lunch just like impeccably both beautiful and complicated. Well, they are expressing their vicarious leisure through putting all of the time, that extra time that they have that I don't have, into making their kids really fancy lunches. And they also may be kind of buying the fanciness, right? Buying the eliteness so that they don't necessarily benefit from that elite summer camp, but their kids do, and it still makes them look like an important and powerful person, right? Let me know if you have further questions on that, because it's a very interesting concept. However, leisure can, and this is another thing we could take advantage of, can be less environmentally damaging. So if we are trying to focus on conspicuous leisure as opposed to conspicuous consumption as a society, then just doing the fancy activities might be able to offset the carbon imbalance in other areas of society in a way that doing conspicuous consumption is unable to. Now, obviously, most of the people doing these activities aren't really going to think about that, but if there is a way to push that through society, then maybe that's a good way to go. A pretty interesting area in this regard is, and this is not on purpose at all, this is only because Ticketmaster are monsters, but ticket prices have been going up pretty tremendously. We've seen that probably the most egregious examples of this being like Taylor Swift tickets, for example. And there's no reason those tickets should be that expensive. But if people are buying those tickets to show and be impressive about it, I suppose that is better for the environment than somebody buying physical stuff that they don't actually need, right? Because nothing is really consumed by going to the arena and watching Taylor Swift for like 3 hours, and this is going to become dated so fast, and it already is kind of. But it's fancy and it's excessive, but it's less bad for the environment. Anyway, though, the shooting guns I put there under recreation, I just put that to show that people of many different lifestyles, everyone does this kind of behavior, and your example of conspicuous recreation could be different from someone else's. That's all I'm getting at there. Conspicuous waste, then, occurs when we buy something or too much of something just because we can. And if we don't give examples of this, this sounds like well, why would any monster actually do that, right? Well, this is exactly what we are doing, at least most people are doing, surrounding holiday feasts in the United States and in our culture as a whole. Um, Ask yourself about your family's last Thanksgiving. If you do Thanksgiving, um, ask yourself, did you eat all that food? You almost definitely didn't eat all that food that day. And probably some of that food, even if you did eat leftovers for a few days, some of that food did not get eaten, right? Some of it got thrown out. That is conspicuous waste. And it should be pointed out that conspicuous waste is often motivated by sentiment, right? My mother will make so much extra food, and if I would say to her, man, I really like rhubarb pie, I wish I could have some rhubarb pie, and I'm the only one in my family that likes rhubarb pie, and she makes a whole of that pie, that is wasteful, because I can only eat 1 or 2 pieces of pie if I'm somewhat responsible, or even half the pie if I'm irresponsible, but that other half of the pie is wasted then. This is the conspicuous waste that is our society's holiday dinners, as nice as Thanksgiving can be sometimes. A historic example, a very ugly example of this, was actually where the concept of big green grassy lawns comes from. This idea actually came from the French aristocracy of the 16th century. And the French aristocracy was known for its disgusting extravagance, right? If something was expensive, then they wanted to do it. And if it could show how little they had to work, all the better, right? So what they would do with their massive palaces and mansions is that they would demand that their servants cut the grass super duper short. And why they would do this would be to show off how little need they had and work they had to do, because other people that controlled that amount of land would have to farm it to grow food to survive, right? And the reason they cut it so short as opposed to just letting it grow is because in a farming situation, you can cut that grass and feed it to animals, right? So there is a use for kind of long weedish type grass, but they were trying to show how extravagant they were, so they didn't. It's also a tremendously good reason to show that we really do not need grassy yards anymore, quite frankly, in terms of a sustainability thing. Do I have a yard made of grass right now? Yes, I do. My wife and I, kind of in our next 10 years, want to try to get rid of that or do something else with it, but it is what we have. It came with the house. Um, there's that example. Additionally, then, uh, one behavior can classify as all three of these things. One behavior can be conspicuous consumption, conspicuous waste, and conspicuous leisure. For example, rich people wearing designer distressed jeans. It is conspicuous consumption in that you buy it and then people see it, right? That's the basic concept, and that would go for any garment of clothing. But it's also conspicuous leisure, because remember, blue jeans originated as the pants that were worn by working people, and in that era, it would have been working men, would be how it was perceived, right? So if those jeans are torn, especially if they're torn in the way that the person in the extreme right hand corner, like those jeans, you can't really get hard labor done in those pants because there's too much of the pants missing, right? That is thus conspicuous leisure. And then also it is conspicuous waste because the jeans are less jeans than when they were entirely whole, right? That is, and hypothetically, you could get more use out of jeans if all of the genes are there. Now, this is not to make anyone feel bad about whatever pants you are wearing at this moment, right? I am just just pointing this out, and then also I would encourage you not to pay $1,000 for any pair of pants, because it's truly silly. We also see this behavior in so-called green culture, superficial green culture, right? With metal straws or um, or whatever, right? BP for a long time, the petroleum company, started calling itself Beyond Petroleum. It was pure marketing garbage, right? Yes, sure, straws can be damaging. They can hurt turtles in very specific circumstances. But you know what also gets past straws? Just drinking out of the cup with your face, right? Just not using a straw also gets rid of straws, right? In that way, it is kind of a conspicuous consumption issue. And then additionally, then environmental tourism or Tesla cars. These can be conspicuous consumption. And if it's not done right, it can actually be just as wasteful as the alternative. If you are fueling your Tesla on electricity that is coming from, say, a wood burning source, electricity source, then you're doing nothing in that regard, right? If your house is solar in some way, that's amazing and that's good. But then additionally, the batteries in those cars are made from what are called rare earth minerals, and mining those are also damaging. Am I saying the move toward electric vehicles is bad? No. We need to do that if we want to keep on having vehicles, but they are not completely green just because they're made in that way. It's about how you use it. Additionally, then, when people do tourism to these beautiful spots in the world, we should keep in mind that unless you are doing that in a more carbon friendly way, and air travel is incredibly carbon unfriendly at this moment in time, you could also be harming the planet while you're trying to enjoy it, right? And that is also something major to be taken into consideration. Just because you aren't driving the plane instead of you're driving the car doesn't mean that's not also putting carbon in the atmosphere. A 4 hour, a 2 hour plane ride gives off so much more carbon than, say, a 10-hour automobile ride, for example. Now, these patterns of things that we do and consumption that we do are also closely tied to our group identity. This is not really new behavior. It absolutely was very well and going into by the 1980s, and it still absolutely continues because as a society we are less community oriented than we once were. So one way that we can find people who have the same beliefs and values as us is the way we dress and we present ourselves. Another way that sociological theory can be used to inform how we consume is to take rational choice theory into consideration. Rational choice theory states that most humans will engage in behavior that makes sense to them as individuals. Now, rational choice theory definitely has some problems with it. When I was in grad school, it was very trendy to have a very strong opinion about rational choice theory. Like all theories, it has its place. It's just a matter of how you're using it, I suppose. But from an environmentalist standpoint, I'm going to eat this food because it tastes good, right? And that could be a hamburger, right? And a hamburger, in terms of a food item, is incredibly carbon heavy. Or I drive this car because there's enough room in it for my family. Well, cars that are often described like that are often quite large and emit more carbon than smaller vehicles would. I burn my garbage in my backyard because it's faster. This is something that was very common when I was growing up in rural Pennsylvania. In some places it still is common, and where I grew up it still is pretty common. And all of these then can result in social dilemmas. A social dilemma being a behavior that makes sense for one individual but can lead to collective disaster if many, many people do it. Most of our issues surrounding pollution can be classified. Pollution is inherently a social dilemma, but many of those pollution issues make sense on an individual level, but do not make sense on a collective societal level. Privilege, of course, also impacts the ways that we cope with environmental problems. It is expensive to only eat organic food, right? It's expensive, or it can be expensive, to be vegan and vegetarian, and it is certainly easier to be vegan or vegetarian if you want to put some money into it. Most things are easier if you put money into it. You can pay people to compost your stuff right. Composting can be kind of difficult, but you can absolutely pay people to take your compost bucket away for you. That is something that people do. And this is really where privilege comes into play there. An applied example is also an example of what we call an inverted quarantine. Kim, that's an example name. Kim is concerned that her local tap water is contaminated and unhealthy to drink. As a result, she only drinks water that has been bottled at least 50 miles away. This is an example of an inverted quarantine. Now, a reminder from our experiences with COVID, a quarantine, in the proper sense, you are isolating the sick person to keep that sick person from making well people ill, right? With the inverted quarantine, you are isolated the healthy person to keep them healthy. And doing that is much more, takes more energy, takes more resources than just isolating the sick people. And in this situation, if Kim actually does only drink Fiji water, because that's my personal least favorite, I'll tell you why in a second, that would be $12 a day to drink that water, $84 a week, $300 a month, and around $4,000 per year to drink water in that way, when it is dramatically less to just drink the water that comes out of your tap water. Yeah, you pay a little bit for tap water, but not close to as much as you would pay to only drink Fiji water. Additionally, Fiji water has a tremendous carbon load to it. The Fiji Islands are in the middle of the Pacific. So not only is it you're taking water, which is heavy, putting it in a plane and shipping it to wherever you are. That is a tremendous carbon load when you could just drink the water out of your sink, which probably comes from a dam that's relatively close by. And then additionally, the Fiji Water Company is very guilty of damaging the aquifer of fresh water in the Fiji Islands to the point where those islands are becoming desert islands, and people who live there actually can't afford their water bills. It's such a bad, it's an unbelievably bad product. Please, I don't tell people to not use products in this class as a matter of ethics, but this one, Fiji water, is reprehensible. Anyway, like privilege, poverty can also impact our consumption patterns. So the ideas of relative poverty and absolute poverty absolutely come into play here. Someone can feel relatively poor if they're unable to buy a new car and they live in a pretty rich area, right? If everyone else can afford to buy a new car and you can't afford to buy a new car, you can feel poor. Now, absolute poverty then occurs when your condition of being poor actually impacts your health in a negative way. So when being poor hurts your health, that is absolute poverty. Now, of course, though, most times when people are in a condition of absolute poverty, they are also in a condition of relative poverty. So the person who is in relative poverty then would be more prone to conspicuous consumption, waste, or leisure because they do have some money that they can spend on these things that are not needed, right? To kind of boost their position in society. I think of the Home Shopping Network in this regard. Home Shopping Network used to be like the place to buy just gaudy, ugly jewelry. If that's your aesthetic, great, go for it. But it definitely played on people who wanted to maybe look fancier than they could truly afford. That's a pretty good example there. And maybe people who were in a condition of relative poverty would do that, but people in a condition of absolute poverty certainly would not because they're trying to feed their family, right? Okay, that is it for this lecture. Please go through and watch the next lecture, and thanks for all your hard work.